Hi, I'm Jess, part-time hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about Tolkien. I firmly believe that we take dragons for granted these days. The fact that winged lizards that breathe fire have become a part of everyday storytelling, it seems bizarre from an outside perspective. And yet, dragons have established themselves as part of the language of storytelling more than any other mythical creature. You don't see a lot of jackalopes being integrated into gritty fantasy novels, nor do you see a lot of children's blockbuster movies about teenagers taming and riding Mothman. Dragons have received that coveted role, and no one, I would argue, wrote them better than J.R.R. Tolkien. For many readers, old and young alike, Smaug is the dragon, and Tolkien's nuanced and modern portrayal of the traditional beast has shaped the way that they're handled in pop culture far beyond the scope of his novel. What is it then that makes dragons so special? The answer, as you may guess from the length of this video, isn't exactly simple, but it's definitely worth discussion. To fully understand Smaug, you have to look not only into Tolkien's other dragons, but into the mythological dragons that he knew and loved. In some form or another, dragons have been part of storytelling and human culture for about as long as stories have been told. Anthropologist David E. Jones proposes that dragons may have originated from an instinctive human fear of snakes. Naturally, then, the only way to make snakes even scarier is to add wings. And thus, we have dragons. Depictions of dragons go as far back as ancient Mesopotamia, where we find beasts with the hind legs of an eagle, the forelegs of a cat, and the tongue of a snake. In ancient Egypt, we have the serpent Apep, as well as the Ouroboros symbol, and in the Far East, dragons were a symbol of the emperor. Dragons took on many different meanings in these cultures, from chaos all the way to fortune, but it is in the Western tradition that we see a pattern emerging of dragons as the servants of evil. For many Western artists, the link between serpents and evil originated in the Bible. In Genesis, Satan takes the form of a serpent and tempts Eve to commit the first sin. Satan uses his serpent form to doom humanity to death and pain, forever establishing it as a symbol of wickedness. We often think of the serpent described in the fall of Adam and Eve as a snake, but the word used in Hebrew is nachash, which certainly didn't imply a dainty garden snake. Elsewhere in the Bible, nachash translates as dragon or sea monster, such as the beast called Leviathan in the book of Job. The Leviathan is described as having eyes like the red of dawn. Its breath would kindle coals, for flames shoot from its mouth. Its flesh is hard and firm and cannot be penetrated. In the final book of the Bible, Satan appears as a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, who, after being defeated by the angels, makes war on humanity. Thus, the Bible begins and ends with dragons as a symbol for evil and enemies of humanity. What we would consider the first true Western dragon appears in writing in the 12th century medieval bestiary. The book was considered an encyclopedia, and despite many inaccuracies, it says a lot about the medieval academic opinion on the animal kingdom. For the scholar, every created thing was a moral symbol, and animals were organized in very careful hierarchies. Dragons were the king of the serpents, whose sole foe was the lumbering and sturdy elephant. The dragon's only hope at victory was to wrap around the elephant and squeeze it slowly until suffocation finished the job. Since dragons were symbols of evil, it was fitting that they would squeeze and choke, just as sin suffocates the soul of the believer. To the average medieval person, dragons were as real as lions or elephants, probably out there somewhere, but not really something you'd pass by on the average Tuesday. They were viewed as spiritual creatures, agents of Satan, or demons in physical form, not just snakes with wings. Now that we know what the first dragons were, let's take a look at how they were used in stories. The Tale of St. George and the Dragon is one of the first English stories to contain a dragon. It's a relatively simple story. A maiden is sacrificed to a dragon to maintain peace in Egypt, where he's been ravaging the countryside. St. George, the valiant Christian knight, rescues the damsel in distress, smites the evil dragon, and wins the girl. The dragon lacks character development and is merely a symbol for all that's wrong. But not every story from this era would portray dragons in such a simple light. Beowulf is an Old English epic that was likely penned in the 11th century, and its original author was never identified. However elusive its origins, Beowulf has had a huge influence on much of the Western storytelling tradition. The tale features a Scandinavian prince, Beowulf, who hears that a beast has been terrorizing the halls of King Hrothgar. He comes to slay the beast, Grendel, who is no match for his ferocity and his wit. The beast's fearsome mother is slayed in a similar way, and though Beowulf may seem like the ultimate hero, Hrothgar warns him that he will someday meet his match. Beowulf rules peacefully as a king for 50 years, but Hrothgar's prophecy will not be left unfulfilled. A fire-breathing dragon becomes enraged when a man steals a bejeweled cup from his hoard. The dragon takes out his rage on Beowulf's land, and even though the warrior king knows that he has no chance at victory, he goes and faces the beast head-on. In sharp contrast to the conflicts of his youth, Beowulf struggles greatly. He is able to kill the beast with the help of a young companion, but he loses his life in the fray. Structurally, Beowulf is a simple tale, but it weaves a complex tapestry of themes, ranging from the meaning of bravery to the inevitability of death. These themes would carry through much of Western literature, and were hugely informative to Tolkien's creative process. The myth of Fafnir would likewise have an undeniable sway on Tolkien's art, as well as the Western dragon tradition. The tale, told in the Volsunga saga of the 13th century, follows Fafnir, the son of Hreithmar. Hreithmar has received a vast allotment of wealth from Odin as repayment for the loss of one of his sons, but Fafnir, consumed by greed, kills his father to take the treasure. Nothing comes without a price, though, and the curse that Odin laid on the gold twists and transforms Fafnir into the sum of his vices, a dragon. Alone and cold, consumed by his own greed, Fafnir curls up atop his ill-earned wealth and guards it with his life. Fafnir's brother tells the hero Sigurd of the dragon and his hoard, advising him on how best to slay the beast. Sigurd follows this advice and hides in a pit to wait for Fafnir to walk over it, allowing him to stab his exposed stomach. In his dying throes, Fafnir warns Sigurd of the curse, telling him that taking the treasure will doom him to misery. Sigurd learns that the brother had been planning on murdering him in order to claim the wealth, and so the hero kills the brother and takes both the wealth and the curse. The Volsunga saga goes on to tell of Sigurd's slow collapse into shame, misery, and death, just as Fafnir had predicted. These tales both serve to highlight the inevitability of dragons in early Western stories. Their presence represents a fundamental shift in the direction of the story. In these depictions, they are not simple figureheads of evil, but elements of destiny, the harbingers of eventual doom even to the mightiest of heroes. Although this Western tradition was incredibly informative to Tolkien, it's important to remember that his reading didn't stop and end with the Dark Ages. Tolkien invested himself in literature of all eras, including his own, and at the turn of the century, dragons were on a precipice. The popularity of dragons began to die out as the medieval era closed and scientific enlightenment became all the rage. Dragons briefly appeared in literature of the Victorians, but humanoid monsters like witches, ghosts, or fairies were much more popular. Writers thought that by placing non-human creatures into the role of the villain, it would shift the blame and imply that the evil was not something intrinsically caused by mankind. These moral quandaries, combined with the Christian connection between dragons and ultimate evil, made them fall out of favor in most literature. However, the discovery of dinosaur fossils threw some fuel into the fire of the dragon myth. And around the beginning of the 20th century, dragons crept their way back into the popular imagination. To distance themselves from negative moral connotations traditionally associated with dragons, storytellers began to portray the creatures in a very different light. Kenneth Graham's 1898 book, The Reluctant Dragon, tells the story of a scaly little fellow who's just looking for a bit of peace and quiet. Our old friend St. George is called to deal with the beast, but diverging from the original tale, he hatches a plan with the lazy dragon, allowing them to part peacefully. Published soon after, Edith Nesbit's Book of Dragons treated them as more of an everyday issue, rather than a real danger. The protagonists, often children, think up clever ways to deal with the dragons, much as one might cope with an angry neighborhood cat. While these interpretations may seem a world away from Fafnir, they couldn't quite shake all of the themes of the old myths. New dragons couldn't be defeated by brute strength, but rather by wit and collaboration. Comedy also began to make its way into the dragon's character, a quality that would later become a hallmark. Tolkien no doubt took inspiration from these dragons when he first told his children the tale of the curmudgeonly hobbit and his clever dragon foe. There was an old dragon under grey stone. His red eyes blinked, and he lay alone. His joy was dead, and his youth was spent. He was knobbed and wrinkled, and his limbs bent. In the long years to his gold chained, and in his heart's furnace, the fire waned. One of Tolkien's earliest dragons is found in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, in the short poem The Hoard. Originally published in 1934, Tolkien proposed it to publishers as a potential sequel to The Hobbit, as The Lord of the Rings was still years away from completion. Although The Adventures of Tom Bombadil would not become the official sequel, many sections of it made their way into the trilogy, as it also took place in Middle-earth. The Hoard begins with a cave filled with elvish treasure. It is found by a dwarf who refuses to leave and is eventually twisted by his greed and turned into an inhuman creature, concerned and consumed only with the accumulation of wealth. The dwarf is in such a stupor that when the dragon arrives, it kills him easily. However, the dragon likewise becomes chained to the Hoard and is so consumed that all he desires is guarding and keeping the wealth. A knight kills him while he sleeps and takes up the Hoard, inevitably suffering a similar fate. He is killed by passing soldiers, and the Hoard is left empty, perhaps awaiting its next foolhardy victim. Undeniably, the dragon of this poem lacks the bite and wit of Tolkien's later creations, but we can note some important common factors. The dragon is the only non-humanoid character portrayed, but he is still depicted with human qualities. Tolkien avoids turning him into a caricature or a mere symbol. By bestowing him with the same status as the humanoid characters, Tolkien allows him to live and breathe within the world, and come to his own well-deserved ruin, just as the others. The dragon is the embodiment of greed, and the too human lust for wealth. He was cunning, inquisitive, greedy, well-armored, but not overbold. But at any rate, he was not in the least afraid of flies or insects of any sort of size, and he was mortally hungry. Next in the evolution of Tolkien's dragons is Chrysophylax from Farmer Giles of Ham. Although not published until 1949, Farmer Giles was in development for many years before. According to his son, Tolkien first conceived the tale in 1926 while sheltering under a bridge with his family during a rainstorm. The short story was also submitted as a potential sequel to The Hobbit, and although denied, it holds its own as a pseudo-medieval comedic tale. The story follows the titular Farmer Giles, who saves the village from the attack of a rampaging giant by accidentally firing off a blunderbuss into the giant's eye. Farmer Giles is immediately lauded as a hero, and the king rewards him by sending a sword from the royal armory. Although Farmer Giles appreciates the praise, it comes back to bite him when a dragon, Chrysiphilax, hears that the village is ripe for the picking and comes to eat his fill. Farmer Giles, as the resident village hero, reluctantly faces the dragon, who is, by nature, quite lazy, and toys with Farmer Giles, hoping he can trick the man to get an easy meal. Farmer Giles is only saved by the sword the king has given him, which turns out to be Tailbiter, a renowned dragon-slaying weapon. Chrysiphilax is instantly cowed at the mere sight of the weapon, and when confronted by the villagers, he agrees to pay back the damages he's caused using the money from his mountain hoard. The villagers are too consumed by greed to realize that Chrysiphilax has no plans of returning with the promised money. The king, who assumed he would be getting a cut of the payout, is enraged and sends a troop of knights, joined by the newly knighted Farmer Giles, to retrieve what he thinks he's owed. When they arrive, Chrysiphilax is prepared for the fight and easily tears through the knight's defenses. His rampage is only stopped by Farmer Giles wielding Tailbiter. Terrified, Chrysiphilax tries to negotiate, which fortunately is Farmer Giles' strong suit. Like village men bartering for the price of a tomato, they come to a generous agreement. Chrysiphilax will keep enough of his wealth that he won't be utterly humiliated with the other dragons, and in exchange he'll help Farmer Giles carry the rest of the money back to the village. He acts as a de facto bodyguard, or guard dog, really, and scares off the king, establishing Farmer Giles as the new ruler. The Tale of Farmer Giles is Tolkien's celebration of the very clever coward. If anyone other than the lazy and humble Farmer Giles had borne the sword, he might have engaged in combat rather than negotiating. Likewise, the dragon was just cowardly enough to get away with his life. Chrysiphilax is practically a fully developed character, and his wit and humor are unparalleled. Though Chrysiphilax may lack some of the primal might of the Norse legends, we see Tolkien's vision of what a dragon is being fleshed out, filled in with all of the nearly human details that make him such a conniving and formidable foe. The next dragon, Skeitha, is more of an honorable mention, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to show off this depiction of him. There's something in his eyes that it always brings me back to him.
Something always brings me back to you. It never takes too long.
Skeitha is briefly mentioned as a worm of the Grey Mountains. He was the mightiest of the cold drakes, meaning that he wasn't a fire breather, but he was still a formidable enemy. Skeitha was killed by Fram, the leader of the group that would eventually become the Rohirrim, and the Horn of Rohan that Éowyn gives to Merry originated from Skeitha's hoard. Now, let's get on to the really scary ones. Before the rising sun, Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky, and he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Ancalagon the Black is known as Tolkien's largest and fiercest dragon. His name means rushing jaws in Sindarin, and the fearsome beast certainly lives up to that name. Ancalagon the Black appeared in the War of Wrath that closed the First Age of Middle-earth, and led the army of dragons that the Dark Lord, Morgoth, kept on reserve in Angband. Once his legions of orcs and balrogs had been defeated, Morgoth sent the dragons out as a last-ditch effort against the armies of the Holy Valar and elves. Eärendil, the legendary elven mariner, faced Ancalagon in this final conflict. Aided by Thorondor, the king of the eagles, and his army of massive birds, Eärendil struck down Ancalagon and defeated the armies of dragons, winning the battle for the Valar. Ancalagon fell down upon the great towers of Thangorodrim, a group of massive volcanoes that Morgoth had raised up over Angband. Due to his colossal size, the mountains of fire were broken under his weight, and the resulting carnage led to the destruction of Beleriand, where many of the tales and myths of the First Age had taken place. The destruction of Thangorodrim signaled the end of the War of Wrath and the capture and chaining of Morgoth. Once again, we see that dragons are being used at the turning of the tides, just as they were in Anglo-Saxon and Norse myth. Ancalagon the Black was the final hope of Morgoth, and his failure led to the ruin of his plans for some time to come. Ancalagon the Black bore all of the awe-inspiring primal terror of the early dragon myths. Tolkien had shown what true power and fear could look like in its raw form, and was only a few adjustments away from creating the perfect dragon. In the front of that fire came Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons in his might, and in his train were Balrogs, and behind them came the black armies of orcs in multitudes, such as the Noldor had never before seen or imagined. Tolkien's Glaurung seems almost the perfect encapsulation of evil. He is creeping, conniving, and his victory seems entirely inevitable. Glaurung means gold worm in Sindarin, and he epitomizes nearly all that dragonness was to Tolkien. Glaurung was the first fire drake that Morgoth created, and he was called the father of dragons. Though he didn't have wings, Glaurung was one of the most dreaded weapons in Middle-earth at the height of his power. His first appearances were during the Elves' siege upon Angband. He was a major force at the Battle of Sudden Flames, which was called Dagor Bragolach, as well as in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Glaurung was at the head of armies of Balrogs, orcs, and dragons, wreaking havoc on elven armies and razing down fields with the force of his fiery breath. Glaurung's most storied purpose was in his fulfillment of Morgoth's curse upon the descendants of the human warrior Húrin. Glaurung sacked the hidden elven city of Nargothrond upon Morgoth's command, which brought him face to face with Turin Turambar, the son of Húrin. Glaurung stunned Turin to stillness with the powerful spell of his lidless gaze. The beast spoke of Turin's many past mistakes, weaving elements of the truth into a convincing web of lies. He told Turin that his mother and his sister Nienor, whom he had not seen in many years, were suffering enslavement in Dor-lómin. He then gave Turin the choice to go and save either his sister or an elven princess. Turin chose to pursue his family, falling directly into the center of the web Glaurung had woven. His mother and sister were not in any danger at all, but were safe in another city. All according to Glaurung's plan, Turin was chasing after falsehoods. Satisfied with his work, Glaurung took the city of Nargothrond as his new lair and gathered all its wealth together to create a hoard. Turin's sister was worried for her brother's fate and went out to find him, but was intercepted by Glaurung, who drove her mad with the foulness of his stench. As a result, she lost all memories of her brother, and when Turin found her, he didn't recognize her, since he had not seen her since she was a baby. Turin took her to recover, and within 3 years, they fell in love and conceived a child, fulfilling the curse that Morgoth had laid upon them. Years passed, and Turin never forgot the sacking of Nargothrond, nor the deceit of Glaurung. When he learned that the beast was traveling through the countryside, Turin lay in a cleft in the ground. When Glaurung passed over it, he drove his sword up into the creature's soft underbelly, much like Sigurd of old, and wounded the beast fatally. When Turin went to retrieve the sword, however, he was burned by Glaurung's black blood and fell unconscious. Turin's sister had been following him, and with his dying breaths, Glaurung restored her memories and allowed her to remember her old life. Thinking Turin dead and realizing that she had taken her brother as a lover, she hurled herself off of a cliff into the river below and died. After waking, Turin learns the truth as well and throws himself upon his sword, and thus, Glaurung fulfills the wicked curse that Morgoth had placed upon the children of Húrin. Glaurung is the embodiment of self-consuming greed, conniving wit, and terrifying might. He is the acting force behind a tale that makes the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet look like child's play. For Glaurung, there is no bitterness in his defeat, since destiny still has its way. There's no hope for the heroes to escape the beast's power, which to some Tolkien readers may come across as a bit odd. Tolkien's endings are somewhat infamous for being satisfying and often happy, if not roughly an hour and a half of extra screen time long. And indeed, the tale of the children of Húrin doesn't fit into some of the themes that Tolkien would ultimately wish to express with his works. It's lucky, then, that this is not our final dragon. I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Then I was but young and tender. Now I am old and strong, strong, strong. Smaug of the Third Age is one of the last dragons left in Middle-earth at the time of The Hobbit. His name is derived from the German word smügen, which means to squeeze through a hole. Little is known about Smaug before his attack on the kingdom of Erebor, but he certainly does know how to make an entrance. He was drawn to the Lonely Mountain by the wealth that the dwarves had accumulated there, and when he came to take it, Smaug destroyed the neighboring city of Dale with his fiery breath. Most of the dwarves of Erebor were killed or driven into exile, and Smaug took the mountain as his new hoard. He spent the days guarding his treasure, and no one dared challenge him for decades due to his fearsome reputation. Thorin Oakenshield, the rightful heir to the kingdom of Erebor, led a company of dwarves to reclaim the city, aided by the wizard Gandalf and Bilbo, the hobbit who they had hired to act as a thief. The plan was for Bilbo to find the Arkenstone, the gem of the king which would grant Thorin the divine right to rule and would grant him control of the dwarven armies. With such a grand army, Thorin could take on Smaug with brute force and reclaim the kingdom for good. However, Smaug is not nearly as dead or even asleep as Bilbo had been promised, and Bilbo wakes him when he picks up a particularly enchanting golden cup. Bilbo fears for his life, but still manages to engage in banter with the dragon, promising Smaug that he's only there to admire the worm, not to steal from him. Smaug seems to be on to Bilbo's ruse, but he enjoys the game, and they exchange witticisms for some time. During the repartee, Bilbo notices a scale missing under Smaug's wing, the only gap in his armor. Smaug's mounting frustrations come to a head when he realizes that Bilbo was sent by dwarves, and he flies into a rage, bursting out of the mountain. He burns down Lake Town in his wrath, nearly reducing the city to ashes. A thrush, who had overheard Bilbo talking about the gap in the armor, informs Bard the bowman, a descendant of Dale, of the weakness. The archer is able to use a black arrow to fell Smaug once and for all. With a shriek that deafened men and felled trees and split stone, Smaug shot into the air, turned over, and crashed down from on high in ruin. Unheroic little Bilbo creates the opportunity for Bard to defeat the dragon and save the people. It's the perfect death for the mighty, arrogant dragon. And though Smaug's death results in the Battle of the Five Armies and a great deal more destruction and death, The Hobbit doesn't end on a sour note. Though bittersweet, good triumphs over evil. This is the key difference between Smaug and his predecessors. In Glaurung, we see all of the features of the dragon, but on a cosmically malicious scale. In Smaug, we see the kind of villain that suits the scope of a charming children's tale. Smaug's evil is selfishness and greed that feeds off of the characters in the book, perfectly displaying how a good monster shows off the monstrous qualities of humankind. Smaug is deliciously fearsome, complex but not confusing, and obviously laced snugly into the historical dragon tradition. And most importantly, Smaug, the symbol of evil, is defeated and doesn't lead to ultimate death and ruination. Destiny may bring about dragons, but in Tolkien's world, it will not let them win. I think Tolkien said it best when he wrote simply that he desired dragons with a profound desire. I think these words can resonate with a lot of us. There's a reason that, according to Tolkien, dragons had the trademark of fairy written plain upon them. They're certainly unreal, and one doesn't need to worry about seeing Ancalagon the Black in Walmart buying cheddar cheese. But they're made up of real elements. Dragons give a name to the primal forces that we've always seen, but never been able to fully exterminate. Dragons are inevitable, the certainty of change that will always come about. However, as we see with Tolkien, change doesn't always mean destruction. Evil doesn't need to win, even if it will keep cropping up where we don't want it. In fantasy, we see an echo of our world, a foggy view through a mirror that allows us to look back at ourselves with much greater clarity. In dragons, we see that the threat of evil is real and present, but in stories, we learn that they can be defeated. Thank you all for joining me this week. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them down below. Tell me which is your favorite dragon and why it's Skatha. Subscribe if you'd like to join me next week to rate some underrated characters, and check out my Instagram linked right down below. I hope you all enjoyed this week's discussion, and that you all have a very happy Hobbity day.